Thank you very much, Mahesh. It's a great honor to be here. And coming to this place, it's a kind of unique peace which I am feeling right now. And moreover, like when I began to think about Rahul Sankrityayan and his works, then I thought, like, what are the other works which people have done? Then I found that this institute is doing for the first time a full-fledged 3-day conference on him and his contribution to Buddhism. And then I began to see like how he has contributed to Buddhism as well as his Gyan Bharatam mission. And the thing which I found that in terms of Gyan Bharatam mission, that one has to look up the manuscripts and what meaning, what message they convey. But other thing which Rahul Sankrityayan is doing, that how he is basically challenging the entire Western colonial mindset, particularly through his travelogues. And the countries which he has traveled, I think before me, Gautam sir has referred one or two works. He has a collection of, I think, 5 volumes about his journeys, his traveling to different countries. And in Tibet, in Nepal, in Sri Lanka, Japan, and many other countries. And why he began to emphasize about his travelogues. The reason is that in 1943, the British government in India has passed a law which has criminalized all the, like what you call, the people who are roaming around the country. And it was saying that these people, they are like a kind of robbers, they are vagabond. And then Rahul Sankrityayan began to actually glorify that they are not robbers. So his travelogues are in a way direct challenge to the colonial law of 1943. It's called Bengal Vagabondsy law, which prohibits people like who move from one place to another place and calling them criminal. And this is one thing. And other thing which Rahul Sankrityayan is doing through his emphasis on Buddhist religion, that there is a kind of, actually he began to actually explore different religions. And he found that in certain cases, at certain point, you have some kind of clash. It can be the clash of civilizational values, clash of some kind of inner hierarchies. But Buddhism is a religion which is above all these kind of classes. And he calls that Buddhism is something which is not about clash of civilizations, though this term is by Samuel Huntington, which came much later, but it's about universalization of civilizations. And this is also, if you remember, like how he is countering the entire colonial idea. If you remember, this very short poem by Kipling, it's called the Postman. Very short poem, I think some 14-15 line poem, where Kipling talks about Indian culture, Indian forest, Indian Indian the places. And in the poem, Kipling says that the place where Britishers are living, that is a glorious place. And and the rest of the place is full of robbers. And the Britishers are worried about a letter which the Queen has sent for the British people, and the Britishers think that this Indian postman boy will actually steal the letter, or he may be killed by robbers, or maybe he will be eaten by some kind of jaguars or maybe leopards in the jungle. So Kipling criticizes, calls the Indian scenario as some kind of exotic, which is full of robbers, full of lions, jaguars, and other kind of animals. And Sankrityayan takes these kind of like representations at different level, which is also, so he is in a way contributing to the idea of Gyan Bharatam mission by critiquing the colonial representation of India, by critiquing the colonial representation of Indian people and many other cultures. And so this is the line where I will be talking about. Maybe I'll be brief since this is, I think, you are sitting here since morning. And the idea, like what I began to think about, that when Rahul Sankrityayan began to think about the people who move from one place to another place, and when Britishers called them that they may be criminals, Rahul Sankrityayan says that this is the point where Western people have got wrong. Western people think that only some kind of material advancement can be the source of the growth of human beings. That human beings can be seen someone like who are civilized, who are having some kind of rational mindset only because of some material achievements. Sankrityayan says no, traveling was the only medium which has kept human values, human society alive. He begins to give, when we like think about his very famous book, this is, he calls Ghumakkad Shastra. And where he says that when we think about like how people began to know about the Western world, about America, he calls them Vasco da Gama and Columbus as like Ghumakkad. Someone like who travels from one place to another place and then they have discovered the world. So it's not about only scientific discovery, but like the people who travel and then how they keep the society alive. This is number one. Point B, that he talks about Mahavir Swami, about Gautam Buddha, about different, about Shankaracharya, that how they have traveled from one place to another place, and because of their traveling, how they actually made the society aware about certain kind of values, like what is right, what is wrong. And as well as their entire teaching was through traveling, not by like sitting at one place and having sermons. So he talks about that the British law, which prohibits people moving across boundaries, across what you call states, is something different from what India thinks about people moving. And then when he was visiting for the first time in Tibet, and he actually has taken what you call a kind of guise of a beggar, where he finds things like that the only way he can travel was not in the form of like that he can look like a gentleman and then wear a proper clothes and he'll be like starved. So he begins like as a person who is begging from like Nepal. He enters in Nepal, then Tibet, and then he moves to different parts of Tibet. And what he then explores about the Tibet people and Tibet culture. He says that like in Tibet there are like different what you call, he uses the word Jagir, which means that they are like independent small states, and each one of them are like sufficient. And the person who is called Jagirdar, like he is seen as someone like who takes care of the entire, I mean the territory which he is in charge of, takes care of that territory. And then there are certain bhikshus, the Buddhist monk, who is working in those jagirs. And he writes that this is from first Tibet Yatra, that those Buddhist monks, they are seen as someone like kings. Though Jagir is the someone like who's a ruler, but he treats the Buddhist monk as a king. And then he talks about a different system which they have evolved in terms of taking care of their animals, in terms of taking care of crops, in terms of taking care of the responsibilities of law and order. So through his travelogue, through his journey, Sankrityayan is saying that Britishers were always saying that India cannot rule by, maybe Tibet cannot rule by themselves. The people of Tibet cannot rule by themselves. So he is saying that at their smaller level, they have their own legal system, they have their own justice system, and which is countering the entire Western approach of that they are the people who are not having any kind of system to rule over, to run their states. And then he moves to talk about the jungles, the forests, like how they have to move, and about the people. At one point, he says like when he was going for the first time in Tibet, he was like in the guise of a beggar, but he found the place to stay, which was much better. I mean, so like how people focus on the importance of human beings, not about the importance of like what status one is having. So he talks about the like how in terms of the people like who are follower of Buddhism, are the people who are living in Tibet, they actually emphasize human beings first, not the kind of approach, not the kind of appearance which they actually carry. Then he talks about his another journey which happens 5 years later, where he is like addressing a kind of a very rich person. He says that he is not able to locate any place to stay, and the place where he finds he can stay, that is like a very poor man in Tibet who gives him a shelter. So talking about the kind of changes which has happened because of certain kind of the change, the cultural and social changes which has happened, and how people are skeptic, and how the people like who are very poor still they actually uphold cultural values, the social values. And then he in some other travelers, he talks about like how he can the people like who are traveling, what they can have. He talks about the like importance of traveling, and when people travel, and then can they actually possess a lot of material things. Sankrityayan says this may be a kind of difficulty, but people should have some kind of knowledge about different kind of arts. It can be music, it can be dance, it can be some other arts. He prefers that maybe the people like who actually play a flute. So carrying a flute can be one thing. They like very light to carry. As well, so the example of carrying a flute, when you see the entire work, it is in a way representing how like Indian culture or maybe the entire Indian values, they are different from the Western material values. So it's like when you travel, you have less things. And he is trying to counter the materialistic culture of the West, and saying that he's denouncing the materialistic culture. I say like the minimum you have, the happier you can be. And then he has these are like his travels about Calcutta, about Bihar and some other parts, where he talks about the people like who are coming from backward caste. The people like who belong to the crowd, you can maybe, if I use something similar English word, maybe gypsies. And they say the people like who belong to backward caste in India, and like when you think about their travelers, and they say, Sankrityayan says that this is because they are not having any home, but they are not concerned about that. Like they move from one place to another place, and wherever they stay, they make like a kind of small hut, and then they work. He gives different examples from Rajasthan, different places where people actually carry. This is like person who will be carrying maybe some prefer buffalo, some prefer cows, some prefer donkeys, and then they have all the luggage on them, and then they move from one place to another place. They can find any free land, and then stay there for a few days and move on. And so he says that these like people, when they travel from one place to another place, they are not simply like what you call traveling meaninglessly. The word which he uses, that the people like who travel, he says that like one is like purpose, and another is a non-purpose. So non-purpose is also a purpose of traveling. And what is this non-purpose? This non-purpose can be like getting familiar with different cultures, different people, different societies. And sometimes the people like the locals, like who meet these traveling people, they learn like where they come from, what kind of culture they carry. And so this is like in a way trying to reveal that how people actually have, despite different language barriers. At one point, Sankrityayan writes that if you move in India from one part, let's say from Delhi to Hyderabad by aeroplane, then you will find that you are living in going to a bit different, encountering a bit different language, different culture. But when you move on foot, then you find that you are not having any kind of language barriers. Because you are like meeting the people and you are learning their culture, slowly you are like proceeding further. So what he says that when you travel on foot and then you mix up with the people and the language barriers disappear. But when you have modern means of transportation, and suddenly you find that you have entered in different cultures. And so these gypsies, like which move from one place to another place, they bring up some kind of cultural similarities, some kind of linguistic similarities, and where people can understand what other people is living through. And then he has something to reflect over about the religions of traveler. Among all religions, Sankrityayan has said that Buddhism is above all kind of discriminations. But he says that traveling is a new religion. And traveling has no caste, no oppression, people can come and meet together. So he says that if you want to actually avoid any kind of violence, any kind of clashes, then one can think about traveling. But he also thinks about, he gives references of the people who have done a lot of violence, who were also travelers. He gives examples of Mongols, like when Mongols came to India and the kind of attack which they had. He gives examples of the Hood attack. He gives example of Mughals. They came initially as travelers. He says this is not the purpose of traveling, that when they move from one country to another and then or one place to another place and then oppress and then eliminate all the people. So this is the only reference where he talks about from 7th century till Mughal period, that there were travelers who also have done a lot of violence, but this is not the purpose of traveling. He gives the other purpose of traveling, where people mingle together and where people actually try to understand one's culture, society, and then begin to live peacefully. And this is the focus like which he has given in most of his writings. Like where he talks about when you have like his 4 times journey in Tibet, 3 times journey in Sri Lanka. He talks about how people began to actually understand each other and how people develop the knowledge of the country, knowledge about the people, knowledge about their culture. And I may be the knowledge about different communities. When I just was reading, I think few days back about this lecture, his Ghumakkad Shastra. And when he talks about the backward communities and traveling, he says that people usually have the faith that the division of caste is basically some kind of division based upon some kind of maybe the work, or maybe some kind of you have segregation, social segregation. Sankrityayan says that one has to look up the different culture, different practices of each caste. So different communities can have the sources of different cultures. That is what he says in his book, The Ghumakkad Shastra. That caste is not only in terms of segregation, but each caste has different practices, maybe at the time of childbirth. That every community has different practices. At the time, like when like a baby is like named, you have some sanskara. Or like when one is getting married. So at different point, different communities has different practices, and one can know this when they begin to move, and people can actually feel somewhere which can surpass all kind of the so-called division between different castes. So if one has to see in terms of oppression, this is one way. If one is looking in terms of culture, then it can actually eliminate the barriers in caste in terms of different communities. And then he also talks about like how one should have love for traveling, and then one should not fear about death. He talks about his experiences of traveling in Tibet when he was going as a beggar. He says that he found at certain places deep down in the what you call mountain valleys that the people like who fall and then die. I mean, there is nobody to inquire about them. And then there were certain army camps which were left empty then, and those were places where people used to actually stay in the night, and sometimes they were what you call the places where nobody is found, so you have to spend the night alone. And then he talks about the kind of serenity which he found in those army camps, revealing that uh, the what you call when you have like Kipling who calls that Indian atmospheres in Indian society, Indian people, Indian culture, and maybe different places which are like full of some kind of threats, fears, or maybe the forest are fearful. And Sankrityayan says that like when he began his journey from contemporary Bihar, and then moved to Tibet, and wherever he entered in jungles and forests, they were not what Kipling was describing earlier. So this is like how he encounters Indian and maybe the Tibetan culture, and says that the representation which we have from different Western sources, this is their approach of looking the cultures, and one has to actually look at this from how we see it. And this is one way where he is trying to put that the Indian knowledge system, or what one can say in different idiom, Gyan Bharatam mission, that one has to revive the manuscripts, or maybe one has to critically look up how one is being represented. And the one of the like very famous book which he has, if I think we almost all of know, maybe those who have come from like Department of English, by Gugi wa Thiango's Decolonizing Knowledge, so decolonizing mind. But something like what Sankrityayan has written much before, that like how people like has to get freedom from the colonization of mind. So people, nobody has thought about Sankrityayan. Maybe everyone knows about Gugi wa Thiango. And why Gugi wa Thiango becomes so popular? Maybe his book was published in some Western press and became very popular. And then he also says that like despite like all kind of what you call universal civilization, or maybe in terms of countering Western values, one has also to look up the non-purpose of traveling. He never used that term purpose, non-purpose of traveling. And though I am translating into English, non-purpose. And the non-purpose of traveling can be that documenting one's experiences. So traveling for the sake of traveling. That's the non-purpose of traveling. And whatever else happens, those are something very different, or maybe very secondary things. And this non-purpose of traveling can be in the form of like one can actually document like while coming back and then documenting their memories, or maybe that they are writing only for the sake of keeping their records alive, like wherever they have gone, how the society they have seen, what kind of people they have met, and how they contribute to different cultures and how they understand each other. And finally, when we think about like a Gyan Bharatam mission and cultural representations which he had, so the entire purpose is to look at like how India has contributed. We are not simply borrower of the Western knowledge system, but we are also going to emphasize Indian knowledge system. And Sankrityayan has done simply by writing his travelogues, that where he went and the people who he met, the kind of culture they had, the kind of society they are living in, how they respect people, how they receive people. He says this is something very different from the Western culture, the Western values, the Western knowledge system which they can offer. And his Travelogues may be a kind of the record of the different places where he traveled, but it can also be a very important document for contributing in the Gyan Bharatam mission. So with this point I will end. Thank you very much.